Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of 914 Wired. I'm Charlie Stern. My partners in this endeavor are Peter Moses and Ardina Seward. Hello, Peter and Ardina.
Hi.
And we have a very special guest with us today. Reaching into the world of journalism for some expertise and depth of knowledge. David Kaufman is a New York Post columnist and a news features editor. He focuses on politics, business, and culture, not unlike this show. He has also authored a book called Pride 50 Years of Parades and Protests. He's worked as an editor at the New York Times, the global digital director at Architectural Digest. You've written tons of things. You know what you're talking about. Welcome to the show, David. We're delighted that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So now, Ardina, why don't you tell us why we've asked David to join us today?
Well, because not only is he a writer, but he is also a very, very interesting man. He is not only African American, but he's also Jewish, and he's also written extensively about the current problem in Israel, and he is also an adjunct professor at, I believe it's the University of Tel Aviv. David, correct me if I'm
No,
wrong.
I'm an adjunct fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute.
At Tel Aviv Institute. So
Yes.
he has a unique perspective on Israel and what's happening in Israel. In light of and the reason why I asked him to be on the show is because in light of all of the protest and the basically anti-Semitism that's going on in the United States and in Europe, I'd like David to weigh in on the perspective of African Americans who have basically joined the fray in terms of being anti-Israel. So, David, you take it.
Well, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, I think some African Americans have, obviously not all of them, and this is an instance which is emblematic of this entire conflict. With those who are screaming and speaking loudest tend to be the only ones who are heard and drown out the rest of the folks back at home. So we also have a sort of complicit mainstream media that very much likes to promote this idea of this rising conflicts between blacks and Jews, centered around Gaza, centered around Palestine, centered around this conflict, and most importantly, the role that this schism, as has been presented, is going to play in the election, and most importantly, will it doom Joe Biden to losing the crucial African American votes, or losing some crucial African American votes in specific states, particularly swing states like Michigan and the lot.
David, before you continue, let's keep in mind that you work for the New York Post, and they're major purveyors of some of this division that you're talking about.
I would actually not agree with that. The New York Post really
Mm.
hasn't weighed into the Black Jewish story very much, at least not that I've been aware of. It's, if you actually look at it, it's mostly been the New York Times. I wrote a piece about this for AirMail a couple months ago, and in the piece, I note that the New York Times had basically done 4 or 5 large stories about this perceived schism between blacks and Jews in the period of a month, and then of course there was a lot of follow up to the NAACP announcement last week, where the head of the NAACP was advising that President Biden no longer immediately stop arming Israel. This seems to be actually more of a progressive and left issue than on the right. I think mostly because from my perspective, the folks who are screaming loud that there is this schism, the folks who are screaming that Biden is at risk of losing support, tend to be on the progressive side, tend to be from more progressive left-wing institutions, and I suspect that more conservative, particularly church-based groups, the mainstream church-based groups, not extremist church-based groups, actually aren't focusing that much on this issue. I would assume that most African Americans are voting with their wallets and pocketbooks in mind, and are concerned about things like inflation and jobs, and perhaps the issue around immigration right now, and whether immigrants who are undocumented are going to be taking their jobs. I don't think African Americans are spending a lot of time up at night stressed out about Gaza, but I do think the loudest ones are.
But hang on one second here. I'm having some dissonance because you talking about the this historical alliance between African Americans and Jews. Your name is David Kaufman, but there's a book by a guy named Jonathan Kaufman. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not, but Kaufman's a pretty
Okay.
common name.
Oh, okay. So there was a professor at Queens College. I'm thinking maybe early 1990s. He wrote a book about the Broken Alliance. It was called The Broken Alliance, about the turbulent relationships between African Americans and Jews. And I thought maybe it
Yeah.
was you, but I'm so confused. It's not you. Okay.
I'm a little too young for that.
Different Kaufman,
Kaufman.
same channel, but
Yeah.
okay. So historically, there has been this alliance, but the alliance broke up a long time ago, and this is what I say sometimes to people who talk romantically about it. That alliance hasn't existed for decades. So should we be surprised in any way that there's this gigantic schism? And I would maybe argue, David, it is real.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think the bigger problem here is there seems to be this constant need to sort of harken back to this great alliance and apply it to the current context, and that to me is the biggest problem. I was at an event a couple months ago with Robert Kraft, and he was a former speechwriter from Martin Luther King Jr., who's Clarence. I forgot Clarence. I forgot. I think Jones. I forgot his last name. I'm sorry about that. And they were speaking. He had been in Mr. Kraft's commercial that he had run during the Super Bowl against
Hmm.
anti-Semitism, and they were very much sort of focused on this great alliance in the civil rights movement. Jews had been supporting the civil rights movement and marched in the South with blacks, and blacks had supported efforts in the United States to end anti-Semitism, and blacks have been very, very vocal pro-Zionist. And it was very much like, why can't we resurrect this great alliance? Why can't we lean into this shared history? Jewish Americans have been very fundamental in funding so many important historically black colleges, including Howard. So there was this great foundation. Why can't we lean into it? And for me, what's so frustrating, and we're also seeing, there's an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago in a similar topic. The Manhattan Institute is also having a big panel, again, leaning into this great legacy of joint Jewish and black sympathies, and trying to apply that today. And to me, that's the problem. The problem that this idea that we can find a solution in the past is, as far as I'm concerned, quite flawed. We need to find a fresh solution to these problems because they're fresh problems. And I see it, trying to convince young African Americans that they need to respect this alliance that is from their grandparents' time. That's just not going to work. But B, trying to convince young African Americans that they have so much in common with young Jewish Americans is a loaded gun that's going to backfire in
Yeah.
everybody's faces.
Yeah.
For many reasons. Number one, you know it's just not really true. I mean,
It's a tall order. It's a tall order,
it's a tall order,
right?
and one that's not really based in truth.
Hmm.
The last few decades have seen the vast expansion of economic inequality, and I would suspect the average young black American has never been more economically far removed from the average young Jewish American. Which is not to say Jews are bad and blacks are good. It's just a fact. So that, number one, doesn't really hold water. Number two, trying to shove this agenda down the throats of sort of woke, progressive, activist to young African Americans that they must identify with Jews, as far as I'm concerned, will only perpetuate this sort of myth of omnipotence that Jews are viewed with in the first place. It will only make the
Hmm.
situation work. No young black no young black protester at Columbia with a keffiyeh around his head and a mask on his face will have any time or any patience or any interest about hearing about some great legacy from the past and how we must honor it today. Again, as I said before, that will only prove to them the sort of supposed omnipotence of Jews and the existence of Jews and their role in white supremacy. So right there, that's flawed. But I think the biggest problem, and this to me is the most frustrating one, and it also seems like the most ideal opportunity and the most obvious opportunity, is that that's not the messaging that we need right now. We don't need to convince young black people that they have a lot in common with young Jewish people. What we need to convince young black people is that they have nothing in common with Hamas. That's what we need to do. We need to show these young kids that when they supposedly align themselves with these freedom fighters, they're aligning themselves with terrorists and murderers and rapists and extremists who have no regard for civil liberties or personal rights. So that to me is more of the solution here. It's we need to show that these young people that they've made a mistake. They put their eggs in the wrong basket, and the basket is not just wrong; it's deadly, it's evil.
Yeah.
That's what needs to be done. Young black kids need to understand that they have nothing in common with Hamas.
So
Hamas
then
is not.
where could that affinity possibly be coming from?
I think it comes from a lack, number one, a lack of understanding history,
Right.
particularly our own history. I come from a family on my father's side of African Americans who were the first in our family to go to segregated schools, who were at the front lines of desegregation, who experienced, police brutality in that process. And one thing that frustrates me so much about this baffling alignment of young blacks with the pro-Palestinian movement is that as black people, and this is not just in the U.S., it's also in South Africa, and the quest to end up to an apartheid, the quest to end apartheid and white rule. If you look at both of those movements, in the main and almost entirely, both of those movements were nonviolent. That's why they had such resonance. That's why they had such strength and power, and that's why they had such nobility. Yes, we had Malcolm X, and we had an alternative reality when it comes to Malcolm X, and a much more militant approach to black liberation. And yes, in South Africa, you did have instances of sort of splinter groups of the ANC who did engage in limited terrorist activities, but on the whole, both the quest for civil rights in the U.S. and the quest for equal rights in South Africa amongst blacks were non-violent movements propelled by non-violence. So it's baffling and frustrating and painful for me to see young black people throwing their lot in with the most viciously immoral, violent terrorist organizations I can think of today. It denies our history, and as far as I'm concerned, it is a betrayal of our history. And I think that needs to be communicated with.
Okay,
Again,
all right.
there's so much effort being put to show that, well, blacks and Palestinians are aligned because of our shared history of oppression. No, that is not correct. There is no alignment. There's no shared history. There's nothing in common. We marched through the South hand in hand, nonviolent, and most importantly, the people who suffered as a result of this were black people, not white
Right.
people. So the violence was perpetrated against white people, not against black people. So this is just historically inaccurate and extremely frustrating.
But I think
I'm not.
a lot too has to do with the misperception among a lot of African Americans about what Israel is all about. I think that because not that many African Americans visit Israel,
Mhm.
but also Israel does not promote the similarities in certain aspects of Israeli culture to
Mhm.
African Americans. I mean, there was no point, I guess, up until now to do that. But there's a vibrant rap culture
Mhm.
in Israel. There is an abundance of African people that look like you and me, David, in Israel that are going about their business and doing everything they do there, what we do here. And there is a lack thereof in Gaza. I mean, there are Afro-Gazans that have complained about how miserably they are treated in Gaza because they are dark. You
Yeah.
know, I would say that they're not accepted, but by and large, the acceptance of African Americans in Israel is a heck of a lot greater than it is in Gaza. I mean, don't
Yeah.
forget that a lot of people don't realize that Israel had its own Black Panther movement, which they called their Black Panther movement in the 1970s. So they dealt with racism within their own society. It wasn't African Americans; they were Moroccan Jews, Sephardim versus Ashkenazi. But the point is that the concept was already there. They have dealt with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these points are really important and salient, but as far as I'm concerned, in a way, none of this really matters. What matters, I think, is the core message. Ardina, please don't take. I don't mean disrespect, but what matters is the core message. And in all of these kind of like justifications, we're getting away from the core message. And the core message is that Hamas is a murderous,
Right.
extremist, fanatical death cult that wants to kill Jews. This is the reality. I was at a Shabbat event a couple of weeks ago and met a woman who I didn't ask her, but I believe she was also Black and Jewish, and she said something really interesting that I hadn't really thought of. She told me, even during the height of Jim Crow, the average racist Southern white person wasn't trying to kill Black people. They were trying to keep them down. They were trying to segregate them. They were trying to heavily diminish their economic opportunities. But the average objective of Jim Crow was not to kill Black people. Of course, there were lynchings. Don't get me wrong, but those were the exceptions. The average, the goal of Jim Crow was to segregate and disempower Black people. But the goal of Hamas is actually worse. It's to kill Jewish people. It's to literally round them up and kill them. And we don't have to wonder if that's their goal. A, they've told us, and B, they've showed us on October 7th. They filmed it themselves from their own, cameras embedded in their headgear, and they've made it clear that they want to do it again. So what I'm trying to say is that there is this kind of rational attempt to say, well, we can demonstrate the affinities. We can demonstrate how Israel is a more appropriate affinity for young Black people than say this or that. But really, for me, it all goes back to this one thing: Hamas wants to kill me. They want me dead. They want my children dead. They want my family dead. And that is why I am irate when I see, people out there chanting for Hamas and chanting for jihad, because what they're chanting for is my death.
Let me ask you a question. This is a message that you've been sharing with your readers and other groups of people. How is that resonating when you meet young Blacks? Are some of them swayed by what you say, or are most of them acting indoctrinated by the other media?
Well, I mean, I don't meet. I mean, I'm like a middle-aged dad, so I don't meet lots of young people. But I think that it. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier. I think the average young Black kid is not really paying a lot of attention to this issue. I think what we're hearing is the loudest voices. And I think it also is bound up in the reality of our elite institutions. I wrote a story for The Spectator a couple of weeks ago where there was an article in the New York Times right before President Biden, excuse me, went to have the commencement at Morehouse, and they talked about all these reasons why Black historically Black colleges and university HBCUs were not protesting the way Columbia and other schools were. They talked about the fact, the economic realities for young Black kids, but what it really, really came down to is that the reason why you aren't seeing protests of against Israel and for Palestine at historically Black colleges is because there are no Jews there. These schools have no Jews, and there's no point in creating massive protests against Israel and for Gaza if there aren't any Jews to imperil and intimidate along the way. And this, I think, is a big issue, a big main point. I also think that one of the main reasons why I think your average Black person is not particularly invested in this issue is that, there probably aren't a lot of Jews in their world. So they're not particularly connected to this. It's only in these elite institutions where the target is clear, and as is the audience and the access to media.
Well, David, we're about to find out here, right here in Westchester County, where this show is based. Peter, Ardina, and I are all from Westchester. And as you probably know, because the Post covers it, there is a congressional race underway right now that is turning out to be somewhat of a referendum. Frankly, I'm
Yeah.
just going to say it. It's a bit of a referendum on Israel.
Sorry about that.
And this is a district with a significant non-white population, a
Mm-hmm.
significant African American population, heavy African American representation in
Mm-hmm.
the Democratic primary voting bloc. So we're about to find out exactly where people stand on this. Yeah, any thoughts on that? How the extent to which these kinds of issues are going to drill down into the local level?
I mean, yeah, this is a very important issue and a very important election. And there's been a lot of energy and, of course, money spent on it. I think we actually have it backwards. We're focused a lot on how Black people are going to vote in this election. But the real question is how will Jews vote? Are Jews who've been historically as aligned with the Democrats, if not more, as Blacks, will they vote for the first time or one of the first times, really focusing on their own sort of, existence in the United States? I think that's going to be the main issue. Will they vote for the traditional?
I'm going to go out on a limb and answer that one for you.
Me too.
They're going to come out, they're going to vote, and
Mhm.
Jewish Republicans are going to vote in Democratic primaries.
Mhm.
All of those things are going to happen because this thing has got energy that I have never seen before in
Yeah.
any election locally in my life. I used to travel a lot for work. I'd go to other parts of the country, Ohio, Florida, wherever, and I would turn on the TV and see all this advertising about primary elections. And
Mhm.
oh my God, so much activity, so much energy. It's like, we never have this in New York. In New
Yeah.
York, it's like no one cares who you vote for as long as you wake up and vote for the Democrat. That's it.
Right. Right.
This
And
time, it's here. It's
yeah,
right here.
yeah, there hasn't been this sort of wedge issue. So I mean, I think that Black people who are committed to voting for Black candidates, generally already have and already will continue to do so. I think in this case, the real issue is where will these Jewish votes go, and will Jews vote with anti-Semitism and October 7th first in mind? If that is
I'm gonna guess that Westchester Jews are going to go between 70 and 80% for Latimer. So if that's the
Mhm.
case, and if like numbers of African American voters vote for Bowman for their reasons, I think
Mhm.
that the race comes down to those who are not Black, those who were not Jewish, and how many of them are going to feel inspired to vote. They may end up being the unknown factor that decides this race, in my opinion.
And I think the majority of them will probably end up voting for Latimer. I think that at the end of the day, your average sort of working stiff, middle to upper class is fed up with this situation. We've seen the disruption of daily life now for 8 months across multiple major New York institutions, from Grand Central to the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's not
Okay,
ending.
but you're saying, and that's a Latimer voter. That's not a vote for African American guy who's not aligned with that Zionist viewpoint.
I think it is a Latimer vote. I think that folks want a return to law and order. I mean, that's why you're seeing such a surge in support, I think, in African American support for Trump. Trump is now scoring higher than ever amongst African Americans, and I think it has to do a lot of the fact that whether or not you support Biden, there is this sort of level of chaos and lawlessness in the country right now. There is a sense that of impunity. I mean, just you can go into a store in New York and shoplift, hundreds of dollars worth of product and basically go home. And your average kind of like, average red-blooded American is not particularly jiving with that. And I think there is a tolerance and a desire, I think, for a certain amount of return to law and order that people want, and they will vote that person in. People don't, people, this, what we're seeing now in the campuses and the streets of New York and other big cities is not the American way. And it's not the America that most Americans want. People are being bamboozled into thinking it is, being bamboozled that these folks, these protesters are chanting for a revolution that the country needs. The country may need a revolution, but this is not it.
So by that basis, do you think that Biden still has a chance to beat Trump?
I think,
Hmm.
well, of course, Biden still has a chance to be Trump. We don't really know what's going to happen until election day, and also we at the end of the day we really don't know how many of these like anti-Bideners are really going to cast their vote with Trump, and more importantly, whether or not they'll just stay home and cast their vote with nobody, and how important, how influential, and impactful that will be on the election. We have no idea who's going to be the president next. But Trump has the thing about Trump that he has going for him is that Biden is threatened on all sides. There are little fires everywhere at his feet. There are little fires from African Americans who are fed up with the fact that he's perceived as being too weak on Israel. There's little fires from Democrats who are fed up, who are perceived that he's being too weak on the Palestinians and Hamas. There's Rashida Tlaib and all of the Arab Americans who've committed to voting for nobody. Trump has none of that. Trump exists. Trump is a convicted felon, and still he exists in this cloud of untouchability and impunity, and that's what he has going for him. He doesn't have to account he doesn't have to account or explain himself to anybody. Biden feels an obligation, particularly because of his position right now as president, that he does have to explain and account to everybody. And every time he does that, in some ways, he's making it even harder. But what is the alternative to basically stay silent and account to nobody? Then
Don't don't forget that the whole dynamic may shift in September because the Israeli government is on the verge of collapse. They're calling for elections. Netanyahu may be out, and you might have a more moderate government involved in September, which in some way could impact the American elections. Because if you have a more moderate government, then that could kind of sway things over more towards, I would assume, towards Biden, correct?
That's a really good point, Ardina.
Yeah, there are multiple competing trends that are all happening all at the same time. There's populism that impacts the left and the progressives, and there's another brand of populism that sweeps in people on the right. And David Kaufman, thank you for being our guest today. You brought some interesting things to think about, certainly in the next between now and June 25th, the Democratic primary, but also the general election in November and the presidential election. And we're going to keep our eye on the New York Post and looking for your byline to talk about this and make sense of this not so straightforward issue. David Kaufman, thank you for
it's never straightforward.
Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
This has been 914 Wired on behalf of my partners in this endeavor, Ardina Seward and Peter Moses. Thank you for listening. Follow, like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. David, I don't